Hey everyone, it's Samuel. And welcome to Plot Hooks, the podcast where we explore the arts of narrative and collaborative storytelling in the world's premier RPG, Dungeons & Dragons. Today in the Prime Material, the Shadowfell. In the Wilds, the sorrowsworn. And in the Tavern, what would you do if the Shadowfell and the Feywild began to bleed together? Hey there, everybody. I hope everyone out there is having an excellent day. I'm excited to be talking about one of my favorite places in the multiverse, the Shadowfell, for today's episode. Before we get into that, though, just some announcements to get out of the way. Remember to follow us on social media. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Be sure, however you're listening to the podcast, to rate it and give it a 5-star review. That really helps spread the podcast to more and more people. Be sure to check out our sister podcast, which publishes also on this feed, Plot Hooks Adventures. We're currently about to wrap up the 4th session of that show, and things are really starting to heat up in the overall storyline that takes place across all of the episodes. A very special reminder that soon the launch of our first ever DM's Guild supplement, Oath of Destiny, a Paladin subclass for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, will be going live soon. Be sure to check it out and share it with all your friends. It's got amazing art done by Devin Simmons, as well as Plot Hook's own Becca. Special thanks goes out to all of our Plot Hooks team, as well as Lex Olden, David Tilstra, and Jess Penley, those who looked at different abilities and helped me tweak different things as the subclass was getting to its final form. We're so excited to share this with you and hope you enjoy it in your games. And if you enjoy the content that we create, the final announcement that we have is we would love it if you could support us on Patreon. It helps us keep the lights on around here and keep pumping out content for all of you. We genuinely appreciate each one of your support. But with all those announcements out of the way, let's get into the Prime Material. Although today, we'll be shifting away from the Prime Material plane and looking at the Shadowfell. The Shadowfell, at its most basic level, corresponds to its other name quite well, and that name is the Plane of Shadow. It's a land of bleakness. There's very little color. It's almost all grayscale. It's very dark, too. There's no skyborne light source like a moon or sun or stars or anything like that. There might be firelight or lights from another creature's creation or light coming off of an ambient source like lava or something like that. Though even in that case, it's still mostly just shades of black and white. But there's no light coming down from space lighting the world. It is just this lightless expanse, this bleak landscape filled with dark creatures, especially undead, things like wraiths, ghouls, ghosts, and the like. And having a space like this is sweet. I really enjoy it. A dark plane of bleak shadow full of haunting features. It's a great place to put your party and a great place to tell good stories. But the Shadowfell goes even deeper than that. And in so doing, it really becomes one of my favorite aspects of D&D cosmology. And that is the idea that the Shadowfell is a reflection of the Prime Material plane. You, of course, have all these fantastic other planes of existence throughout the D&D multiverse. We've done whole series on the upper planes, which are those outer planes which are aligned in some way with good. Things like Mount Celestia and Elysium and Vitopia, things like that. There's also all the lower planes, things like the Nine Hells and the Abyss and Gehenna. There's the inner planes, like the plane of fire and the plane of water. But the idea that the Shadowfell and the Feywild play with is that they're reflections of the actual prime material plane. And that's really intriguing for me. It has a couple of different effects, a couple of different ways that it means that the Shadowfell works differently and plays in our stories differently than those other planes. One is that it means that the Shadowfell looks similar to the prime material. It's entirely its own metaphysical space, of course, but it overlaps the prime material, creating a place that is physically similar to the material plane, but distorted in a dark way. Terrain features, and even in one special case, a city, in the normal everyday world, have these elements mirrored into shadowy forms of themselves. Reading from the description of this in the Dungeon Master's Guide, it says, quote, "Where a mountain stands on the material plane, the corresponding feature in the Shadowfell is a jagged rock outcropping with a resemblance to a skull, or a heap of rubble, or perhaps the crumbling ruins of a once great castle. A forest on the Shadowfell is dark and twisted, its branches reaching out to snare travelers' cloaks, and its roots coiling and buckling to trip those who pass by." End quote. This is different than other planes. All these other planes that we've mentioned have great features. They're amazing, but they're entirely on their own. They're set apart. And that, of course, gives a whole new set of benefits that the Shadowfell doesn't have. But I love this aspect of the Shadowfell, how it reflects the prime material, how it overlaps it, and that makes it different. The second thing that this idea of reflection does differently than other planes is in terms of how to access it. Sure, technically there could be a portal to any realm, anywhere in the material plane, but since the Shadowfell and the Feywild overlap the material, there are locations where the barrier between the two break down and you can pass directly from the prime plane into the Shadowfell. These are called shadow crossings. They only happen in darkness. They can't exist in the light. But any dark area that is sufficiently twisted, usually with death, is a candidate for a shadow crossing. Reading from the DMG again, quote, "A blot of shadow in the corner of a dusty crypt might be a shadow crossing, as might an open grave. Shadow crossings form in gloomy places where spirits or the stench of death lingers, such as battlefields, graveyards, and tombs." End quote. So again, I like this element, this connection between the prime material and the Shadowfell. It helps us tell some really interesting stories. It allows us to ask questions like the plot hook which we talked about in the Tavern segment way back in episode 4, where we asked, what happens if the Shadowfell bled forth into the prime material? These places are so close and so similar. It allows us to tell stories which really play on the twisted nature of things. Sure, you can go to a dark place like the Abyss and really play up a dark storyline, a devious storyline, a storyline with great villains and lots of peril and intrigue. But in a place that is reflective in a dark way, in a dark mirror, so to speak, of the prime material plane itself, you get to really perhaps pull on those threads of dark reality, dark elements of the real world, rather than just this dark storyline which is completely disconnected from the material plane you're normally walking around on. So there's that great backdrop to the Shadowfell in terms of telling stories there regardless. But even beyond that, there's lots of stories that we can tell using the Shadowfell, which I think can create really great narratives around our tables. So we're going to spend the rest of this segment looking at 5 of these aspects. 5 types of storylines which really play well in the Shadowfell. 1 is an undead story. This is the low-hanging fruit, and we'll start there. The Shadowfell is perfect for a story about undead. Whether it be just zombies or ghouls or different things affecting you in the prime material coming out of a graveyard, or whether or not you have to venture into some place to take care of a necromancer or a vampire or different things like that. There's lots of great stories to be told in this vein. The Shadowfell is just really connected to undeath. Sure, there's lots of creatures which thrive in the melancholy and the suffering of the plane. We'll look at the sorrowsworn and their unique place in the Shadowfell in the wild segment. But undead are really the first thing I think of when I think of the Shadowfell. And that makes sense. It's the plane of bleakness. It's the plane of despair. And that would make sense whenever you're thinking about undead. This is a body which has not passed into any sort of afterlife. This is something that's been raised and is just going along in a miserable existence with or without the control of any particular individual. Many different types of Dungeons & Dragons undead even have very sorrowful ways in which they are made. The Shadowfell is a perfect place to tell those kinds of stories if you're looking to really up the ante. Of course, you could just tell the story by having them visit a graveyard or visit a haunted castle, but if you're looking to really up it and to have them impacted by the immensity of a dark plane, incorporating the Shadowfell into that storyline in some way is really intriguing. So the first is an undead story. The second is an encroaching darkness. And this goes back to the fact that the two areas overlap, the prime material and the Shadowfell. And this fact that it's a mirror image, a reflection, that it overlaps, it makes it ripe for the classic storyline of a villain trying to bring his darkness and the darkness of, in this case, the Shadowfell, into the prime material plane. This is a classic trope. The villain is trying to bring his dark empire and make the real world like his space, remake it in his own image. And the Shadowfell really plays into this, because you can have this scenario where this entity, whoever the villain is trying to make the Shadowfell and the prime material one place. They're trying to use some sort of magical enchantment or physical object to transport their dark realm into the real world and spread their darkness to the mortal world. And there's lots of really powerful entities in the Shadowfell who could actually do this. There's shadow dragons, which are the first thing that comes to mind whenever it comes to this. They're an entity in the monster manual, which essentially is an adult dragon or older, which has been living in the Shadowfell and has been tainted by the plane. And now you could have this really intelligent, nefarious, powerful force trying to bring the darkness of the Shadowfell into the real world. Third, the Shadowfell can actually be, if done correctly, a good story about mental health. The Shadowfell is described a lot of times with the word melancholy in the official material. It affects those that are inside of it. The optional rule, which is located in the Dungeon Master's Guide, is called Shadowfell Despair. the initial description of which says, quote, "A melancholic atmosphere pervades the Shadowfell. Extended forays to this plane can afflict characters with despair, as reflected in this optional rule." End quote. There's even beings in the Shadowfell called Shadowkai, which are a race of elves which dwell there. There's not a lot of things that are canon about them in 5th edition, although they have been explored in other editions pretty extensively. While I won't go into the particulars of the previous lore, they often sought after very strong experiences. Whether that be pain or pleasure, they use those things to remain present in the midst of the darkness and melancholy of the Shadowfell. In their case, to not succumb to the shadow curse. And honestly, I don't think I'd run any of these things exactly as written, with the Shadowfell despair mechanic and the ways that the Shadowkai worked in previous editions. But that clues me in on something that exists with the Shadowfell. If done right, it could give an opportunity to tell a story about mental health and how one's environment affects one's mental state. Telling a type of story like this requires a lot of communication with your group, but there's opportunity here to really explore those themes. Again, I would not run a lot of these things as written if you were trying to tell a story like this. Some of the elements of things like the Shadowfell despair mechanic don't work how real mental health struggles work. But just the fact that that theme is there really clues me in again to the possibility of telling a story like this through the Shadowfell. The 4th kind of story is interacting with a Dark Lord. According to the DMG, there are entities in the Shadowfell which are called the Dark Powers. There's not much canon about these entities, but they seem to be some dark force in the plane which is powerful enough to trap evil lords dwelling in the Shadowfell inside of demiplanes which they can't escape. These demiplanes are called the Domains of Dread. The most well-known of these, of course, is Barovia, which is ruled by Count Strahd von Zarevich. That's where Castle Ravenloft is. The whole story of the Curse of Strahd takes place in Barovia, which is on the Shadowfell. It is one of these Domains of Dread. And so the Shadowfell provides a great opportunity to tell a story about maybe a Dark Lord that wants to escape one of these prisons. Or perhaps the party has to go retrieve somebody that's been trapped in one of these demiplanes, having been lured there by some dark force. Like some of the stuff we've already mentioned, that's another really common trope, this campaign that culminates with this evil, powerful force that is trying to escape. But the Shadowfell is just ripe to tell this kind of story. So we've got an undead story, an encroaching darkness, a story about mental health, interacting with a Dark Lord, and the 5th and final thing that we'll cover today is a dark version of a city. I mentioned earlier that there was one city which had a dark reflection in the Shadowfell. In the Forgotten Realms, Dungeons & Dragons' official setting, the city of Neverwinter has a dark reflection called Evernight. There's a little blurb about it in the Dungeon Master's Guide, and I'll read directly from that. Evernight is a city of cracked stone edifices and homes of rotten wood. Its roads are made mostly of trampled grave dust, and its few cobbled streets are missing enough stones that they appear pockmarked. The sky is corpse gray, and the breeze blows cold and humid, bringing a chill to the skin. The city's living residents include mad necromancers, corrupt purveyors of human flesh, worshippers of evil deities, and others who are able to make themselves useful and crazy enough to want to live there. But the living are a minority in Evernight, for the bulk of the population consists of shambling dead. Zombies, wights, vampires, and other undead make the city their home, all under the watchful eyes of the ruling caste, intelligent, flesh-eating ghouls. Now that sounds like an amazing place to play a horror narrative, or just a creepy narrative, or a mystery narrative, or any of the narratives that we've already described. That is a really interesting fact, that there is this city that has a dark reflection, that it's not just the landscape itself that always has a reflection, but sometimes there's just a big city that has a dark reflection in the Shadowfell. And the last line of that blurb in the Dungeon Master's Guide is what really gets me, where it says that rumors abound that this foul place mirrors one city on every world. That gives essentially every Dungeon Master, using whatever setting they are using, in however custom they've made their setting, to take whichever city they want in their prime material and say, okay, Evernight is the reflection of this city in my world. That has amazing story potential. You could rope that into, the encroaching darkness that we've already talked about. How maybe the ruling caste of those flesh-eating ghouls is trying to switch places, switch the Shadowfell version of the city with the Primaterial version of the city, so that they can now encroach en masse the rest of the Primaterial plane. I really like the idea of just this dark version of a town. There's so much you could do with that. But while we could keep going and talking about the cool aspects of the Shadowfell, this very broad and brief overview will have to do us for today. Let's head out into the wilds of the Shadowfell and take a look at the sorrowsworn. We're out here in the wilderness. Today, we're going to be looking at the sorrowsworn, and if you've seen the art for these 5 different entities, you'll have wished you wouldn't be looking at the sorrowsworn. But they are incredibly fascinating entities from the Shadowfell, incredibly creepy and cool, and great to tell stories with. As I said, there's 5 varieties of them, and you can find them in Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes. At their core, all sorrowsworn are essentially the negative emotions that pervade the Shadowfell given physical form. The terrible suffering and distress that's inherent to the plane can manifest in these embodied forms of pain and hurt. The 5 varieties are the angry, the hungry, the lonely, the lost, and the wretched. Now, because there are 5 different ones with 5 different stat blocks, we're not going to go through all the specifics of the stat blocks as far as using them in a combat scenario, but they are great to use in stories. This idea of this dark place being so dark that negative emotions can be given physical form is really fun to play with. The angry is a vicious 2-headed monstrosity with hooked arms, which feeds off of anger and violence. It's built into its stat block that it gets stronger if you fight against it. And the lore says that it actually gets confused if you don't. And very Etten light, the 2 heads of the angry actually just argue and fight with each other all the time until they have some sort of outside force to pour their anger out on together. The hungry are terrible gaunt forms with giant mouths and these giant claws, which try to eat all living things and all energy sources and everything that they encounter. They'll do whatever they can to try to get full, with their appetites never being satisfied. Again, an element of this is built into their stat block, where if a creature that the hungry sees actually regains hit points, the hungry gets more powerful, gets benefits until the end of its next turn, because it's hungry for their life. The lonely is obviously the personification of the isolation which exists among many within the Shadowfell. These sorrowsworn really want to interact with others, and they have long arms which actually shoot out like harpoons and will pull you in, trying to get close to whoever it can. And again, this is built into its stat block. You take damage if you're close to it, because it's literally... The ability is called Psychic Leech. It's literally just leeching away your life force as it's trying to connect with you. And it actually gets benefits. It gets advantage on attacks if it's within 30 feet of at least 2 other creatures. Otherwise, it has disadvantage on attack rolls. It gets stronger the more people are around it. It just craves contact. The Lost. Of course, the personification of not being able to find your way. They always seem anxious, desperate, panicked, and they always try to hug anyone they come across for relief. Unfortunately, for those who they do come across, they try to hug you with 5 arms, 2 coming out of their shoulders, 2 coming above the normal ones out of their shoulders, and 1 coming out of its chest, all of which come to these terrible-looking spike points, not hands, but spikes, and they want to embrace you with those 5 arm spikes. And the Wretched is the weakest of all of the sorrowsworn. The others are all a variety of challenge ratings, the Angry being 13, the Hungry being 11, the Lonely 9, the Lost 7. The Wretched is all the way down at a challenge rating of 1/4. It's just a small entity that looks like a disgusting T-Rex with the mouth from the creature from It. And they just want to subsist. They're just like wretched, as their name suggests. And they just try to go around seeking anything that they can survive on. And that's built into its stat block by its bite attack being able to actually make the wretched attach to the creature that it tried to bite. These attack in large numbers. They even have an ability called Wretched Pack Tactics, which gives advantage on attack rolls if at least one of the Wretched's allies is within 5 feet of the creature that it's attacking and that ally isn't incapacitated. Otherwise, the Wretched has disadvantage on attack rolls. So they gang up on you, these small wretched beings. And these 5 entities are really interesting to use. They're very Shadowfell. 3 do psychic damage and 2 do necrotic damage. They all have this ability which grants them resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage while they're in dim light or darkness. And that goes whether it's a magic weapon or a silvered weapon or anything, no matter what, as long as you're in dim light or darkness, they have resistance to that type of damage. These are very Shadowfell creatures, and I love how they're so connected to the plane with the way that these elements are built into their stat block. They really are just personifications of these wretched emotions which exist in the Shadowfell. So they're great creatures to use anytime you're in that plane. They really give a great sense of the emotions that the players will be affected by. It shows them just how serious this dark place they're in really is. But you can use them in the prime material too. I think they're excellent creatures, even to use in a prime material place if you have a wasteland type area in your setting. I have this area in Carrick in the War Wastes. And I think a lot of custom settings have some sort of war in the past which has devastated an area of a continent and made this just dark and wretched place. And using the sorrowsworn in those environments, not even on the Shadowfell, can be really fun as well. And one final way that you can use them in this story is, while there's nothing about this in their stat block, their lore states that giving in to negative emotions makes them grow stronger, and fighting against them can drive them away. You can have this instance where, again, you're using them in perhaps the actual prime plane, and the negative emotions of a town. Perhaps the town is incredibly angry, and they're so angry that these entities are literally manifesting. The anger individuals are manifesting in the town because of the emotions of the place. Their lore even says their nature provides a clue both to understanding how they become more powerful and to overcoming them. So if you wanted to alter their stat blocks where they literally change if the people around them are becoming more angry, or if the people around them are becoming more lonely, if they literally become more powerful in that instance, that's just really cool. And even if you don't want to change their stat block, just having that in terms of when they appear is just really fascinating. There's lots of great things about the sorrowsworn, and they're just fascinating to use in a story. But that's about all the time we have for the wild segment for today. Let's head finally out of the Shadowfell and back to the tavern and get some refreshment. Alright, we're out here in the tavern. Today's plot hook: what would you do if the Feywild and the Shadowfell bleed together? As I mentioned earlier in the episode, we talked way back in episode 4 about what would you do if the Shadowfell began bleeding into the prime material. But since that's already taken for today's Shadowfell-themed episode, what if these two reflections of the prime material meld together? You know, the Feywild is like the Shadowfell, whereas the Shadowfell is this melancholy place, this dark, twisted, warped reflection of the reality of the prime material. The Fey is also a reflection. Its landscape also resembles that of the prime material, but it's a wild reflection, a very magical reflection, a dangerous reflection. Wild, I think, is the best word I can think of, which describes just the magical chaos that exists in the Feywild. What happened if those two were blended together? Because they're not exactly opposite sides of the same coin. It's not like the Shadowfell is the dark reflection and the Feywild is the light reflection. In some ways that's true, but the Feywild isn't like a pure reflection and the Shadowfell is a evil reflection. It's not like a good and evil like that, and it's not a thing of chaos and law either, because the Feywild is very chaotic and the Shadowfell is very chaotic. They're both reflections, but they're not exactly equal and opposites. So when you mix the two together, you don't just get the prime material, you don't go back to normal. But what do you get? And I'm not honestly sure, but the idea of coming across a particular region on your continent in your world, or a particular scenario where you have both of these elements bleeding through, where there's both Fey crossings and Shadow crossings, and you're going back and forth between the two, and the two are even mixing in some areas, and you've got this dark and despair-filled tribe of pixies, and you're just like like you just start melding and mashing these two things up, I think that could create a very weird, interesting, and fascinating story. I think it would be a perfect way to perhaps clue in the players if your plot line is something that is planar, where you have perhaps this storyline coming up where the barriers between the planes are falling down, and the first thing that you perhaps see, if that is going to be the climax of your campaign, is the fact that this is happening with the Feywild and the Shadowfell, these planes which are the closest to the prime material. Then maybe they start noticing it with the inner planes, that where the plane of fire starts bleeding through here and the plane of water is bleeding through here, and you see that they're starting to mix, and you start seeing things like that. Maybe this could be your introduction to it. Maybe it could be someone doing this. Someone is warping reality itself to just make chaos happen. Maybe it is an archfey or some other powerful member of the Feywild that ended up in the Shadowfell that is now somewhere halfway between the two, or even the other way. Maybe it's one of those mysterious dark power entities that ended up somehow transferring to the Feywild and now has become more Fey and somewhere halfway between the aspects of the Shadowfell and the aspects of the Feywild. And now they're trying to join the two planes together to better fit their image. It's just a fascinating aspect and really tickles my fancy because I just love interplanar nonsense when it comes to Dungeons & Dragons. But, unfortunately, it's about time for the interplanar nonsense to come to an end for today. Thanks very much for listening. Remember to check out our Patreon. Remember to check out Oath of Destiny, which is launching soon on the DMs Guild. Follow us on all our social media. Rate and review the podcast. And as always, thanks so much again for listening from me, Samuel, and all of us here at Plot Hooks. Steve, Dave, Becca, Zach, Mike, Matt, and of course, podcast Pupper Ellie. We'll see you all again next week for another episode of Plot Hooks.